Okay, our next speaker, now I know we're running a little behind, it's okay, we got some built-in time. I've known him for hours. No, not a little longer than that, yeah. I met Louis Kraft in California at an Order of Indian Wars, where I met a lot of you wonderful people. And Louis and I both spoke at that conference. And I really liked his speaking abilities. He writes wonderful books. Gatewood was his specialty. Now he's getting to Colorado and Sand Creek, getting close to home here, since we live in Colorado. But Louis has unique speaking style. I once said he writes like he speaks, beautiful. Louis doesn't give speeches. He gives performances. And Louis Kraft is now going to perform for you on Gatewood. Come up, Louis.
Michael. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm putting it here. My hands don't work anymore after that. And folks, I don't know what to say. Is this out okay? You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. It's way too much. On March 27th, 1886, Geronimo, a Badankahe Apache, in Naiche, the last Chacone, or Chacon, or Chiricahua chieftain, and the remnants of their people surrendered to General George Crook at Cañon de los Embudos, Sonora, Mexico. This should have ended the last Apache War. Should have. It didn't. Instead, it set in motion a series of events that would resurrect a lieutenant whose career all but ended when he dared to speak up for White Mountain Apaches in 1884. Unhappy with how Crook treated him during the surrender talks, Geronimo began drinking. On the second stop, the second camp on the trip back to the United States, he, Naiche, and somewhere between 34, 38, 39 people slipped into the night and vanished. In short order, Crook resigned as commander of the Department of Arizona, and General Nelson Miles, who actually campaigned for his position, replaced him. Miles immediately dumped using Apaches to fight Apaches, reducing them to little more than scouting duty. He assembled 5,000 soldiers to patrol the international border and guard all the known waterholes. Using the 4th U.S. Cavalry as his primary offensive weapon, he began sending patrols into Mexico to hunt the Apaches. 3 months passed. Geronimo, Naiche, and the rest of them were shot up, worn out, hungry. But they weren't dead. Miles had no intention of failing. While continuing the hunt, he decided to send an officer to Mexico to negotiate with Geronimo. Although he didn't know who this officer should be, he knew it couldn't be any of his men, for none of them knew any of the warring Apaches. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 men best suited for the assignment were no longer available. Captain Emmett Crawford was dead, and Lieutenant Britton Davis had resigned his commission. This left the man who had stood up for the White Mountains in 1884, First Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood. The Apaches called Gatewood Bachin Dazen, which means long nose. Tall, slender, and southern born. Gatewood graduated from West Point in 1877. Soon after joining the 6th U.S. Cavalry at Fort Apache, Arizona Territory, he became a veteran Indian campaigner. Gatewood, who knew all of the adults in the warring band, soon became one of Crook's hand-picked subalterns to bring peace to the Southwest. By 1884, he was not only an experienced commander of Apache Scouts, he was military commandant of the White Mountain Indian Reservation, headquartered at Fort Apache. His career looked promising. Then, in 1884, he arrested a territorial judge named Francis M. Zuck for defrauding the White Mountains. Crook told him to drop the charges. Gatewood refused. When Zuck's case went to trial, the presiding judge tossed it out on a technicality. Zuck was a judge. He should be in his own district, presiding over his own court. Zuck immediately arrested Gatewood on felonious false arrest. Gatewood appealed to Crook. The general turned his back on him. And when Gatewood's trial started, it was also tossed out on a technicality. This judge ruled that the United States government had no jurisdiction over events that happened on an Indian reservation. Nevertheless, this ended Gatewood's working relationship with Crook. Oh, and by the way, they never did see eye to eye. It also ended his working relationship with the Apaches, and ultimately his participation in the last Apache War. By 1886, he was exiled to northwest New Mexico territory. He thought he had seen the last of the Apaches. He was mistaken. On July 13th, Miles summoned him to his office in Albuquerque and ordered him to find Geronimo in Mexico and demand his surrender. Well, the mission sounded like suicide. Besides Gatewood's bad health, his arthritic condition wouldn't hold up. Miles had no intention of taking no for an answer and offered to make the lieutenant his aide-de-camp upon successful completion of the assignment. Now this Gatewood liked, and he accepted the assignment. Knowing he'd never get close to Geronimo with an armed command at his back, he kept his initial entourage small. It included Martin, a Naiche Apache, Kata, a Chacone Apache, both of whom knew members of the warring band. Interpreter George Ratton, who was fluent in the Apache dialects, and Packer Frank Houston. After outfitting at Fort Bowie, in Arizona Territory, Gatewood set out on July 16th. Everyone rode mules. 3 days later, he dropped into Mexico. He moved eastward in Sonora, cut through the Guadalupe Mountains, and into the Mexican state of Chihuahua. A blazing sun, downpours, and a rugged terrain played havoc with his health. His joints ached. He suffered from dysentery and had an inflation of the bladder. When he reached Caracas on July 21st and met Lieutenant James Parker, who was supposed to show him Geronimo's trail, Parker said, "No, the trail's all a myth. I haven't seen any trail since over 3 weeks ago when it was washed out by the rains." Only 50 miles into the Mexican interior, his health gone, his mules worn down, and now no trail to follow. Gatewood thought for a moment, probably wondering if he'd survive, then said, "Well, if that is so, I will go back and report that there is no trail." "Not at all," Parker replied. "If General Miles desires you to be put on a trail, I will find one and put you on it." If indeed Gatewood had wavered from the task at hand, he no longer did. If the fear of failure haunted him, it was now gone, along with any thoughts of quitting. He decided to rest in the hope of recovering his health. During this time, it rained nightly, sometimes torrentially. The soaked ground attracted hordes of mosquitoes and sandflies. Finally, after 6 days, Gatewood decided he could travel. During this time, no reports of Geronimo arrived. He didn't even know the whereabouts of Captain Henry Lawton, who led Miles's primary command in Mexico. Without a set plan, he decided to return to Sonora, with his ultimate destination being Naiche or wherever he might find Indian sign. Returning to Sonora with now Parker's command acting as his escort, he reached the pueblo of Arispe on the Rio Arispe. He had still not found anything. Instead of moving into the Terrace Mountains, he decided to move southward and spread the river. Sierra Madres loomed to the east. Gaetan, Martin searched in sign for vain and found nothing. It was almost as if Geronimo had vanished from the face of Mother Earth. By the time Gatewood reached Tuachinera, malady had struck the column. Parker's men began to drink. Close to insubordination, they assaulted the towns, drank mezcal, and took every available woman. A disgusted Gatewood reached Naiche on August 1st. He then moved southeast. 2 days later, he found Lawton on the Rio Aros. Lawton also had no idea where Geronimo was. But worse, Lawton wasn't pleased to see him. He said he intended to hunt Geronimo down and kill him. He made it clear to Gatewood that he didn't want him around. By this time, the infection of Gatewood's bladder made riding difficult. He again considered quitting, then changed his mind and kept after Lawton until the captain gave in and allowed him to join the command. It rained nightly. During daylight hours, temperatures soared to 117 degrees. Lawton meandered first in one direction and then another, sometimes only traveling 2 or 3 miles in a day. He found nothing, and Gatewood's health continued to plummet. By August 8th, Gatewood found himself deep within the Sierra Madres, ill, with no chance of completing his mission in the near future. A long, hard campaign is one thing. Dealing with men that didn't want you around was an entirely different matter. Wanting out, Gatewood approached Lawton's second-in-command, Assistant Surgeon Leonard Wood, and asked to be medically discharged. Even though Wood had made numerous entries in his journal regarding Gatewood's bad health, he denied the request, and Gatewood continued to limp on with Lawton. Days passed. Then, on August 17th, Geronimo surfaced. He was seen 15 miles south of Fronteras on the road to Nacasari. He had made a paraje, an overnight camp at the Quechua Ranchero. The next day, Lawton and Gatewood heard that 2 women from the Apache camp, Tadasta and Tejona, who spoke Espanol, had opened negotiations for peace at Fronteras, 70 miles to the northwest. They decided that Gatewood would make a forced march that night. But when the appointed time arrived, Gatewood's health again abandoned him. He stalled, probably hoping for a miracle. As the hours passed, Lawton became more and more agitated. He even considered arresting Gatewood and replacing him. Then on August 19th, at 2 a.m., Gatewood put his health problems behind him. Took Martin, Gaeta, Ratton, several packers, and 6 of Lawton's men, and set out for Fronteras. He walked and rode 55 miles, forced a halt at Chupa. He didn't resume his traveling until the next day, the 20th. Upon his arrival at Fronteras, he met with Jesus Aguirre, the Prefect of Arispe. Aguirre controlled the Sonoran district of Arispe, which included the pueblo of Fronteras. The meeting didn't go well. Aguirre did not support Gatewood's mission. Afterwards, Gatewood camped with an assembly of American troops 3 miles below Fronteras. After dark, Aguirre visited the American camp. He told several of the officers that he didn't want them present when he negotiated peace with Geronimo. He told Gatewood he intended to get the Apaches drunk and massacre them. He then ordered Gatewood to end his hunt for Geronimo and leave the area. Gatewood refused, citing the agreement between their countries that allowed him to be in Mexico. Nevertheless, he just hung around camp for the next 2 days, doing nothing. When Lawton heard of Gatewood's inactivity, he left his command and pressed on to Fronteras. However, before he found Gatewood, he met with Aguirre and agreed to have a drink in a cantina. Unfortunately, Lawton couldn't hold his alcohol. He got drunk, and after the prefect left, began insulting Mexican soldiers. Luckily, Wood was present and dragged his commander into a back room to sleep it off. Later that day, Gatewood arrived looking for Lawton. Wood assumed command and ordered him to find Geronimo. By the time Gatewood returned to his camp, he knew exactly what he would do. Well, a small command prepared to move out. He made a point to meet with the prefect one last time. He assured Aguirre that his hunt for Geronimo had ended and that he would rejoin Lawton's command. Back at his camp, Gatewood enlisted 2 additional interpreters. Jesus Maria Estes, who might have been Jose Isques, lived in Fronteras, and Tom Horn. Just before dusk, Gatewood moved southward. After traveling 6 miles, the sky had turned dark. He ducked into an arroyo. You see, the march was little more than a ruse to convince anyone who might have trailed him that he would do exactly as he had told the prefect. Now, certain that he hadn't been followed, he moved eastward into the mountains. Sometimes after midnight, he moved north back toward Fronteras. After daylight arrived on the 23rd, Gatewood halted to give his men a much-needed rest. During this time, he jotted a note to Lawton outlining his plans. After sending a soldier to deliver it, the hunt continued. Gaeta and Martin found the trail that the Apache women left. It moved eastward, down the mountain toward the Rio Avispe. By the time Gatewood reached the river, it was obvious by sign that the Chiricahuas were near. He slowed his march to a crawl. That afternoon, he called a halt. Other than walking and short breaks, his men had been in the saddle close to 24 hours. Gatewood moved out early in the morning of August 24th. At the entry to the canyon that led into the valley of the Avispe, the trail, the 2 women joined those left by the rest of the Chiricahua band. Gatewood announced the line of march. Gaeta and Martin would lead the advance, followed by the bulk of the group with 2 soldiers 100 yards to the rear. The scouts refused, saying, "We are not greedy, but are willing to divide the glory to be had by the whole party." I still think that was the best plan, Gatewood later wrote. Nevertheless, everyone moved out together. The canyon had a foreboding aura, almost as if daring them to enter. They did, one step at a time, all eyes darting upward from jag to ragged jag as they inched forward. Nothing happened, and they reached the end of the canyon without incident. Afterwards, Gatewood poked fun at his own heroic person, saying, "That proved to be a very innocent canyon. And after we got through it, I was sorry I had not gone ahead." The march continued. By this time, the sun had reached its zenith. Sweat rolled down their eyes. Sweat rolled down their faces, burning their eyes. Excuse me. As the noon hour neared, Gatewood reached the big bend of the Arispe. At a canebrake near a peak that offered a good view of the surrounding country, he called a halt. After camp was set up, he asked the 2 scouts to go out and find Geronimo. This time they moved out without an argument. During the way, Gatewood sent several messages back to Lawton. Expecting to meet Geronimo the next day, he requested supplies and tobacco. Late that afternoon, Lieutenant Robert Brown and 30 scouts reached his camp. Lawton was following, but wasn't close enough to offer support. Just before nightfall, Martin returned. Kieta had remained in the Chiricahua camp. Martin described their position, the Chiricahua position, as a high, rocky spot, high in the mountains, near a bend in the river. He said that Geronimo and Naiche wanted to talk peace with Bachin Dazen, and only Bachin Dazen. Naiche sent word that no one would be harmed if they behaved themselves. After an anxious night, Gatewood packed 15 pounds of tobacco that Lawton had sent him that had arrived during the night. It was still dark when he moved out. Martin led the way. Brown's scouts served as escort. After traveling several miles, Gatewood began to climb the mountain that Geronimo held. An unarmed warrior appeared, then 3 armed warriors. They said that Naiche and Geronimo would meet at a bend in the river where there was water, wood, grass, and shade, but only if the Indian scouts left. You see, these scouts were White Mountains. The White Mountains didn't like the Chiricahuas. Gatewood agreed, sent Brown and the scouts back to the canebrake. Then he, Rat, Estes, Horn, maybe 1 soldier, and the 4 warriors set out for the designated location, reaching it shortly after 8 a.m. There was no one there. Suddenly they saw armed warriors on the mountain above them. As the warriors began to descend, Martin later remembered that we were nervous, for we didn't know if Geronimo had changed his mind and meant trouble for us. When the warriors reached the mountain base, they vanished, only to explode out of the brush from different directions. Somewhere around 20 warriors, maybe somewhere between 35 and 40 people surrounded Gatewood. Kiata appeared. There was no sign of Geronimo or Naiche. Gatewood greeted everyone, then took off his arms. The warriors immediately asked for mescal and tobacco. Gatewood had no alcohol, but he passed out the makings for smokes. Everyone rolled cigarettes and lighted up. The next few minutes passed easily as Gatewood smoked and chatted in an American Apache Spanish pidgin. Geronimo walked in from the brush, set his rifle down and crossed to Bachin Dazen. As they shook hands, he said, "Inzu, how are you?" Before Gatewood could speak, Geronimo commented on his slenderness and apparent bad health. Gatewood explained, and they sat down together. Too close, too close. For Geronimo's revolver rubbed against Gatewood's midriff. Gatewood asked, about the negotiations with the Mexicans. And Geronimo explained that he needed supplies, wanted some mezcal, and needed time to rest, and figured the Mexicans would give it to him if they thought he would surrender to them. Naiche appeared. And as he shook hands with Bechin, the rest of the warriors pressed closer, sitting in a semicircle around the lieutenant. Geronimo announced that they were now ready to hear what he had to say. Gatewood didn't feel very confident at that moment. He later wrote, "Gentle reader, turn back. Take another look at Geronimo's face, staring me straight in the eyes, watching my every movement. Some 25 bucks surrounding me, fully armed. My small party scattered about, performing the duties incident to a peace commissioner's camp. And say if you can blame me for feeling chilly, twitching movements." The time of reckoning had arrived. Gatewood said, I am instructed by General Miles to demand the surrender of yourselves and followers to the United States government. On what conditions, Geronimo asked. An unconditional surrender. Accept these terms, and you and your people will be sent to Florida, there to await the decision of the President as to your final disposition. Accept these terms, or fight it out to the bitter end. Silence. Geronimo rubbed his face, his eyes. He held his arms before Gatewood and made them tremble. We have been on a 3 days drunk, he said. The Mexicans figured to play their usual trick with us and get us drunk and kill us. But we have had the fun, and now I feel a little shaky. We can't surrender. We don't want to go to Florida. We want to return to the White Mountains the same as before. Gatewood told Geronimo that he didn't have the authority to offer terms. If I had been authorized to grant these modest propositions, he later wrote, the entire war might be considered at an end right there. After Geronimo recited all the ills heaped upon his people by the White Eyes, the talk drifted to what the Chiricahuas should do. Warrior tempers flared. Abruptly, the Chiricahuas moved away from Gatewood to speak among themselves. An hour later, lunch was served. Afterwards, Geronimo resumed negotiations with Bechin. Nothing had changed. A return to the reservation with no punishment. To expect us to give up the entire Southwest to a race of intruders is too much, Geronimo said. We are willing to cede all of it except for the reservation. We will go back to that land, or we will fight until the last one of us is dead. Then glaring at Gatewood, Geronimo said, take us to the reservation or fight. Gatewood could do neither. Surrounded, he couldn't even run. Then Naiche spoke for the first time. Bechin had come in peace, and he would leave in peace. Breathing easier, Gatewood decided to say a truth that had not yet happened. He told the gathering that the Chiricahuas that had remained on the reservation and had not gone to war had also been sent to Florida. This shocked the Indians. Are you telling the truth, Geronimo asked? Or is this a trick to get us into the white men's hands? abruptly, Naiche, Geronimo. And the rest moved away from Gatewood. But they came back. They came back. Still, Gatewood didn't know what to say. He distributed more tobacco. Everyone lighted up. And the talk drifted away from the problem at hand, easing the tension. Gatewood summed it up as everyone smoked and ate and joked and drank muddy warm water from the river. Eventually, Geronimo said they intended to stay up all night and discuss the matter. He wanted Bache and Dason to stay with him. Gatewood said no, that his health couldn't handle it. He got up to leave. Geronimo stopped him. Imagine you're one of us and not a white man, he said. Remembering everything that has been said here today, as an Apache, what would you advise us to do? I would trust General Miles and take him at his word. Geronimo accepted this. He said that they would give him their decision the next morning. You can come to our camp anytime, Geronimo said. Never fear harm. Gatewood shook hands all around, mounted, and left. It was dark by the time he reached his camp. He told Lawton, who had arrived sometime that afternoon, that Geronimo refused to make an unconditional surrender. Next morning, scouts yelled for Bache and Dason. Geronimo and Naiche and several warriors had appeared beyond the picket line and wanted to speak with him. Gatewood took Ratton, hissed his horn, and walked out to meet with the Chiricahuas. Geronimo said, if you will give us your word that we can meet with General Miles in safety, we will go to him and accept his terms. We will throw ourselves upon his mercy, something we have never done before. He then insisted upon several conditions. Lawton's command would follow the Chiricahuas back to the United States to protect them from American and Mexican soldiers. Both parties would have open visitation rights to the other's camp. The Apaches would retain their weapons until they surrendered, and Bache and Dason would travel and sleep with them. Gatewood accepted the terms. He then led everyone into the soldier bivouac and introduced them to Lawton, who also agreed to the terms. They selected Skeleton Canyons, some 30, 35 miles north of the international border for they surrendered to Miles. Forced to wait until the rest of Lawton's command appeared, the two parties didn't move out until the morning of August 28th. Gatewood and Geronimo kept to the foothills, while Lawton skirted the Rio San Bernardino. That afternoon, after both camps were set up, Aguirre and his army was seen to the west. Immediately suspicious, Geronimo thought that the Americans intended to join forces with the Mexicans to kill him. Gatewood said no. That the Americans would stop the Mexicans while he ran with the Chiricahuas. Gatewood, Geronimo, and the others mounted and rode northward, halting about an hour later to see what was going to happen. In the meantime, Lawton met with Aguirre. The prefect demanded that the Americans hand over Geronimo and the others so that he could kill them. Lawton said no. The Chiricahuas had surrendered to the Americans. Then, to ease the problem that might have evolved there, Lawton offered to set up a meeting with Geronimo. He sent Wood to announce the meeting. When Geronimo heard, he said no. Wood turned to Gatewood and said, maintain your position until I get Lawton. When Lawton arrived, he told Geronimo that the prefect wouldn't leave until he met with him. Geronimo said no. Before tempers could flare, Gatewood took Geronimo aside and spoke with him. His words worked magic, and Geronimo agreed to the meeting. Later that day, the prefect and his officers, along with Lawton and his officers, arrived at the designated location. The Americans were off to the side, waiting and watching. Neither party dismounted. Unannounced, Geronimo walked in from the brush. He carried a rifle. A revolver dangled on his hip. An unarmed Gatewood followed him, then Ratton, Naiche, and several warriors. They crossed half the distance to the Mexicans and halted. Aguirre and his officers didn't move. Finally, they dismounted and crossed to the Apaches. Using his English, Apache, Spanish, Pidgin, Gatewood introduced Geronimo to Aguirre. The prefect reached out to shake hands. Geronimo reached for his revolver and changed his mind and shook the prefect's hand. When he let go, Aguirre grabbed his revolver. So did Geronimo. This was a little bit too close for Gatewood. He inched off to the side. He later claimed that the whites of Geronimo's eyes turned red. Aguirre fidgeted, then let go of his gun. So did Geronimo. Gunplay had been averted. Aguirre wanted to know why Geronimo didn't surrender to him, and Geronimo said he didn't want to be murdered. Next, Aguirre announced that he intended to follow the Americans back to the United States. No, Geronimo said. You're going south, and I am going north. I will have nothing more to do with you, nor with any of your people. The meeting didn't go well. By the time it ended, Geronimo had agreed to only one condition. He would allow one soldado mexicano to travel north with Lawton. That night, Gatewood realized he had a problem. Geronimo still thought the Americans intended to join forces with the Mexicans. After talking it over with Ratton, Catal, and Martin, he said to Geronimo that he would ride north with the Chiricahuas while Lawton remained behind with the Mexicans. Geronimo liked the plan. They pitched it to Lawton, who agreed. Gatewood, Geronimo, and the Chiricahuas mounted and moved northward. Not halting on the morning of August 29th, even though they were worn out and hungry. Not halting until Lawton, Wood, and several soldiers caught up to them. They sat around in a makeshift camp, waiting for Lawton's command to appear. It never did. Nervous, Lawton sent Wood's orderly back to find his men. When the orderly didn't return, Lawton set out to find his command. Gatewood and Geronimo remained where they were until night fell. Then, under the cover of darkness, they moved northward. After traveling about 8 miles, they found a defensible position and set up camp. The next morning, the 29th, or am I confused here? I think it's the 29th, it could be the 30th. My apologies. They set out, but didn't move far, calling a halt by mid-morning as everyone was tired. Wood, who had remained with the Chiricahuas, set out to find Lawton. By this time, Lawton had found his command, but by the time Wood reached it, he had left to the nearest heliographic station to send a message to Miles. and left the command in charge of First Lieutenant Abiel Smith. This came about when Lawton confided to Smith that he was nervous about keeping his promise of delivering the Apaches safely. Smith told him, "You communicate with Miles. I'll take charge until you return." It was on the 30th I was talking about. That same 30th, Wood and Lawton decided not to wait for Lawton, and they moved northward. On the morning of August 31st, both parties moved out at roughly the same time. But sometime that day, Wood and Smith received a message from Lawton. It's unknown what that message said, but it probably mimicked two messages that Lawton received from Miles that day. The gist of it was, "Send for Geronimo, saying you have a message from the president and for him to come to your camp, and when it is read to him, tell the Apaches to lay down their arms and remain in your camp, or you can do whatever you think best." Whatever that message said, it changed Smith and Wood's outlook toward the Chiricahuas. Later that day, when Gatewood and the Chiricahuas reached the entry into Cañon, Guadalupe, the Apaches became nervous. It was here that events happened in the past. After both camps were set up, warriors rode to the soldier camp to study the back trail and watch the Americans. Smith underestimated the warriors' comprehension of English. He told his officers that he wanted to disarm the Apaches and make them true prisoners. "Well, we had quite a conversation about it," Wood later wrote, "and it was decided in case of any bad situation happening at the conference, or the Indians refusing to be agreeable, that each man should kill the Indian next to him." Obviously, the Indians didn't get the gist of all of Smith's words, but they understood enough. They raced back to Naiche and Geronimo and announced that Smith intended to pitch in with the troop and have it out right there. Panic reigned as the Chiricahuas mounted and hustled to get out of the canyon. Ratton, who had been in the soldier camp and had left shortly after the warriors had, told Gatewood that Smith and Wood approached at a leisurely pace. Gatewood leaped onto his mule and raced after Geronimo. When he caught up with him, he repeated what Ratton had told him. Geronimo slowed his mount to a crawl. "What should you do in case we are fired upon?" he said. "I will approach the troops and endeavor to have the firing stop," Gatewood said. "Otherwise, I will run away with you." They continued on until they found a defensible spot. Then Gatewood, Geronimo, and Ratton rode back to meet the soldiers. When they saw them in the distance coming forward in single file, they halted and waited until the soldiers reached them. Gatewood asked Smith and Wood what they wanted. Smith said he wanted to meet with the Apaches. Gatewood said no. Smith cited his seniority of rank. He had become a first lieutenant before Gatewood did, and insisted upon the meeting. Gatewood said no meeting. Tempers flared. Finally, Gatewood snapped that he knew Smith's real objective, the murder of Geronimo. Smith ignored this and continued to press for the meeting. Then, according to Ratton, Gatewood threatened to blow the head off the first man that moved forward. Wood happened to be first in line, first to receive a bullet. Sensing the reality of Gatewood's threat, he pulled back and sent an orderly to find Lawton. Smith, now first in line, also sensed that Gatewood had reached the end of his rope. He too backed down. Murder had been averted. Without further incident, the refugees reached Skeleton Canyon late on the afternoon of September 2nd. Geronimo surrendered to Miles on the 3rd, Naiche surrendered on the 4th, and the last Apache war ended. For his accomplishment, which was finding the Chiricahuas in Mexico, talking them into returning to the United States, and then seeing that they got to Skeleton Canyon, Miles made Gatewood his aide-de-camp. At 33 years of age, his career looked promising. It would never be. You see, Gatewood could never eliminate the stigma of being a crookman, an outsider who tried to steal the credit for ending the last Apache war from Miles and the 4th Cavalry. Most of the officers in Mexico that summer of 1886, lieutenants and captains, most of them died or retired, colonels or generals. Gatewood died 9.5 years after he brought Geronimo back to the U.S. He was still a first lieutenant. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you. I have two things I would like to say. Unfortunately, they're pitches, so my apologies. My next book is entitled Sand Creek and the Tragic End of the Lifeway. The manuscript is due with Oklahoma Press on the 1st of October 2016. I have a website blog that went live in April, and I've got to tell you, I am having fun with it, and I pick on things. I talk about race, I joke, I talk about my past, my future, my present, I talk about what I'm writing, and I even have to poke fun at friends like Mr. Mike Corey here. I was trying to get him to buy me a summer house in the land of water and snow. But unfortunately, Dee said, no big deal. Anyway, it is lewiscraftwriter.com. And if any of you know anything about the Sand Creek episodes, eventually I will be opening up to conversations about particular people that participated. And it's going to be from all points of view. So we're talking about everybody. And the best one that comes out towards me, like say Charlie Bent, or let's say John Shivington, or Black Kettle, or whomever, I will be giving them an Indian Wars book from my library. And unfortunately, ladies and gents, I'm a poor writer. It won't be any of my books. It'll be good books, but books that there's no room to put them anymore. So anyway, if you look at it, and I am having fun. Thank you again.